It began quietly, just another parliamentary morning in Cape Town. The air felt heavy, though no one could explain why. A chair sat empty in the front row, the one reserved for Julius Malema, the man who once thundered against corruption and inequality, the man who called himself the voice of the forgotten. But on this day, the day his name was about to echo inside the Madlanga Commission, he was nowhere to be found. Wow! The narrator begins, his voice trembling between disbelief and prophecy fulfilled. Julius Malema got fingered at the Madlanga Commission today. It wasn't gossip, it wasn't rumor, it was sworn testimony on record. 3 weeks earlier, the same voice had warned that 2 red flags would soon reveal the truth. And now here it was playing out exactly as predicted. The revolutionary who promised to liberate South Africa from the chains of the powerful was suddenly standing accused of building his own empire inside those very chains. How does that happen? How does a man who once defied the system end up becoming the system he swore to destroy? And deeper still, what does it say about a continent that keeps watching its brightest suns fall to the same temptations: power, money, pride? For millions of Africans, especially the young, the story of Malema is not just about one politician, it's about the fragility of hope itself. When leaders speak of revolution, yet dine with the elite, when justice becomes performance, and when truth is traded for loyalty, what future can rise from such ashes? So stay with me, because in the next few minutes we're going to walk through the evidence, the silence, and the unraveling of a man once called the people's champion. And then we'll ask the question that haunts every African heart tonight: can integrity still lead a nation? If you believe the answer matters, press like, share this message, and let's uncover what really happened when the revolution turned on itself. 3 weeks before Julius Malema's name thundered through the Madlanga Commission, something unusual was already stirring in the corridors of power. A political storm was forming quietly, almost imperceptibly inside Parliament. Cameras rolled, microphones caught every syllable, but few truly listened to what was being said. Fewer still understood the significance of what was about to unfold. It began when Malema, the fiery commander of the economic freedom fighters, refused a simple procedural request that certain members of parliament recused themselves from an investigation involving their own party allies. The Democratic Alliance had suggested a partial recusal, an act of transparency. Yet Malema went beyond opposition. He rejected the very principle of recusal. "We are not going to be told by Mikonazi what must happen," he declared defiantly. "If he won't make himself available, we will summon him. He is the one who started this mess." At first glance, it sounded like courage, a leader defending institutional independence. But beneath the rhetoric, observers noticed something darker. Malema was closing a door that might soon be used against him. The narrator of the video called it red flag number 1. The second came days later when Malema's committee refused to delay hearings, despite a formal request from Mwonazi, who had written politely saying he was already committed to another legal proceeding. Instead of understanding, Malema doubled down, framing Mwonazi as obstructive, even though the letter suggested cooperation. The contradiction was glaring. "Mark this video," the narrator said at the time. "He's hiding something." And then came the third act, the moment that transformed suspicion into revelation. General Shibiru, a senior police official, took the witness stand at the Madlanga Commission. His testimony was calm, procedural, until a single sentence shifted the entire atmosphere of the room. He stated that Malema was part of a network, 5 individuals involved in mining interests in the Northwest Province, connected through a web of businessmen and political figures. One of those figures, he said, was close to Malema. Another, identified only as Zed, was a bridge between the politician and a high-ranking police deputy. The implication was clear: a cartel of influence where politics and profit were intertwined. Outside the chamber, journalists scrambled to verify the claim. Inside Parliament, silence reigned. Malema was absent that day, the only session he had missed in months. He would return later, fiery and confident, grilling other ministers with his trademark authority as if nothing had happened. But for those who had followed the story from the beginning, the irony was impossible to ignore. The narrator replayed the footage side by side, Malema's earlier speeches and the commission testimony. The tone matched perfectly the confidence of a man who already knew what was coming. Red flag number 2. The narrator had warned he's preparing his defense before the accusation arrives. And indeed, when the accusation finally came, he was already shielded behind his own rules. By refusing to allow recusals, he had built a wall around himself, one that even Parliament could not breach. The revelation rippled through the nation. For many South Africans, this wasn't just about one man. It was about a pattern, the way power bends truth until truth breaks. To some, Malema remained a revolutionary hero framed by enemies. To others, he was the perfect example of how movements die from within. But for the narrator and for millions watching online, this was something else entirely, a prophecy fulfilled. We said it 3 weeks ago, the voice reminded viewers, and now it's written in the record. Julius Malema knew. He closed the door before the storm arrived. The nation had its answer, yet the story was far from over. Because while Malema's name echoed inside the commission, another silence began to grow, the silence of those who had once believed in him. The tension reached its breaking point when General Shibiru's testimony began circulating through South African media. Within hours, headlines screamed, Malema named in Madlanga Commission, alleged links to mining cartel. Television panels convened emergency discussions. Radio hosts replayed the recording of that single devastating sentence again and again. For ordinary citizens, it felt like déjà vu. They had seen this movie before, charismatic leaders rising on revolutionary promises, only to drown in the same ocean of greed they once denounced. But this time, it hit deeper. Julius Malema had built his brand on fire and fury against corruption, against the ruling ANC, against every symbol of elite privilege. And now that same fire seemed to be turning inward, consuming its own profit. The narrator's tone shifted from analysis to lamentation. He didn't sound triumphant. He sounded tired. "Nothing hidden will not be disclosed," he said quietly, quoting scripture. "And nothing concealed will not be brought into the light." 3 weeks earlier, his warning had felt speculative. Now it felt biblical. Inside the National Assembly, murmurs turned into whispers, whispers into arguments. EFF loyalists dismissed the accusations as a political setup, a conspiracy to destroy the only opposition figure capable of challenging the system. Meanwhile, journalists and opposition MPs pointed out the uncomfortable pattern. Malema had not only attended every committee session since, but had aggressively grilled others about ethics and accountability, almost as if trying to redirect the spotlight. During one such session, he confronted Minister Makunu about alleged links to businessman Modi, thundering, "It is your comrade who does that. He's the one saying he knows you, that he works with you." It was classic Malema, sharp, calculated, intimidating. But the irony was unbearable. While he lectured others on comradeship and corruption, the commission was simultaneously revealing his own comrades in a mining network. The narrator overlaid these moments in his video, Malema's voice in Parliament, Shibiru's testimony in court. The contrast was chilling. On one screen, a man demanding justice. On the other, evidence suggesting he had betrayed it. As the footage rolled, South Africans began asking harder questions, not just about Malema, but about the system that keeps producing men like him. How could someone so intelligent, so persuasive, fall into the same traps as those he once condemned? Social media erupted. Hashtags, Zar Malema exposed, and F crisis trended for days. Supporters defended him fiercely, calling him a victim of capitalist smear. Detractors mocked his silence. Memes compared his fiery speeches to sermons of false prophets. For many South Africans, the emotional climax wasn't just in the revelation, it was in the disillusionment. They remembered his early days, a young, fearless orator challenging white monopoly capital, shouting for land reform, speaking truth to power. To see that voice now tangled in whispers of backroom deals and hidden partnerships, it felt like losing faith. Even within the EFF, cracks appeared. Younger members questioned the movement's direction, while veterans urged loyalty. "We cannot eat revolution," one youth leader tweeted bitterly. "We need integrity." The narrator summed it up with haunting simplicity. It's a waste. Brilliant minds, brilliant talent, brilliant passion wasted on Marxist doctrine that teaches power without morality. He wasn't attacking leftist ideology alone. He was warning that when ideology replaces conscience, corruption becomes inevitable. And so the climax wasn't just about Malema being named, it was about what that moment revealed, a movement at war with itself, a continent torn between ideals and survival. In the final seconds of the video's climax, the narrator's voice softened. "You can almost feel God's patience running out," he said. "When men who were called to lead the poor start living like kings, heaven itself will demand an audit." It wasn't rage anymore. It was mourning for a dream betrayed. When the storm finally settled, what remained was not silence but confusion. Across South Africa, in cafes, taxi queues, and townships, people were still arguing, was Julius Malema guilty or simply another target of political sabotage? The question split the country in two. In the days following the Madlanga Commission revelation, the economic freedom fighters EFF faced their deepest internal crisis since its founding. Party meetings that once began with revolutionary chants now opened with tense silence. Some members whispered that the leadership was losing its moral compass. Others insisted that loyalty demanded faith, even when facts were uncomfortable. For ordinary citizens, especially the youth who once saw Malema as their voice, the scandal felt like betrayal. These were young men and women who had believed in his fiery speeches about economic liberation and justice for the poor. Many of them had marched, faced tear gas, and even lost jobs for defending his cause. And now the man who promised them emancipation was being mentioned alongside the very elites he had condemned. The civil consequence was psychological. The idea of revolution itself began to sound hollow. University students on campuses from Pretoria to Johannesburg stopped painting murals of red berets. In the informal settlements where people still lived in tin shacks, the words radical change started to draw bitter laughter. But the political consequence went deeper. Within Parliament, Malema's weakened credibility gave new life to his opponents. The ANC, long accused of corruption itself, used the moment to paint the EFF as hypocrites of revolution. The Democratic Alliance seized the scandal as proof that populism was dangerous. International observers began questioning whether South Africa's opposition was capable of moral leadership at all. The narrator of the video captured this sentiment perfectly. It's not just Malema on trial, it's the whole idea that a man can fight corruption without first conquering it within himself. The fallout rippled beyond politics. Civil society groups that once collaborated with the EFF on land reform distanced themselves. Church leaders began speaking out, warning that South Africa was being consumed by a spirit of deception, where leaders spoke the language of liberation but lived the lifestyle of kings. Television debates filled the airwaves with one haunting refrain: can South Africa still believe in revolution? And yet amid the disillusionment, something else began to awaken, a quiet yearning for a different kind of leadership. People started looking north to Burkina Faso, where another young leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, was charting a contrasting path. In his speeches, Traore spoke less of ideology and more of integrity, less of Marx and more of moral sovereignty. For many Africans watching from afar, the contrast was painful but necessary. If Malema symbolized what happens when revolution loses its soul, then Traore represented what happens when courage meets conscience. By the end of the week, protesters outside the Union buildings in Pretoria held signs that read, "We want truth, not theater." Others quoted the same verse the narrator had used, "Nothing hidden will not be disclosed." For South Africa, the scandal had done more than expose one man. It forced an entire generation to confront its own illusions about power. Because when every promise of freedom begins to sound rehearsed and every hero begins to look familiar, the people finally remember the one truth no leader can escape. You can build a movement on anger, but you can only build a nation on integrity. From Washington to London, the story of Julius Malema's fall traveled quickly, but not because of his politics. It was because of the pattern it revealed. Western analysts saw in South Africa's turmoil something eerily familiar, a continent still wrestling with the same moral paradox that has haunted it for decades: revolution without responsibility. In the United States, political commentators on African affairs divided sharply. Some conservative voices on American talk radio praised the Madlanga Commission's revelations, calling it a victory for transparency in Africa. They argued that the West had long warned about populist movements that promised equality but delivered corruption. Yet others, especially within the black diaspora, felt conflicted. For them, Malema's humiliation represented not just personal failure, but a painful reminder of how easily African leadership collapses under internal pressure, often amplified by external manipulation. American think tanks like the Brookings Africa Center released briefings emphasizing that African populism mirrors global populism. They drew parallels between Julius Malema and figures like Latin America's Hugo Chavez, or even early U.S. grassroots movements, leaders who rose on anger but fell to ego. The irony was not lost on anyone. While the U.S. media discussed accountability in Africa, the same week Washington itself faced congressional investigations into campaign corruption. The narrator of the video reflected on that hypocrisy. It's easy for the West to lecture Africa about ethics, but corruption is global. It only changes accent. In Europe, reactions were more cautious, but still revealing. British tabloids framed the Malema saga as another African tragedy, while independent European journalists questioned whether Western companies were secretly benefiting from the chaos, especially in the mining sector at the heart of the scandal. After all, every political fall in Africa tends to reopen the door for foreign influence. But perhaps the most striking response came from within Africa itself. Across the continent, leaders and citizens began contrasting Malema's situation with the emerging leadership models in the Sahel, particularly Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Western analysts had called Ibrahim Traoré a military populist, but now, next to Malema's story, his image seemed purified by comparison. While Malema defended his silence before commissions, Traoré was seen working in the field with engineers, farmers, and miners, without bodyguards, without theatrics. While South Africa's politics dissolved into committees and commissions, Burkina Faso was building schools, cleaning cities, and nationalizing resources. African newspapers began printing headlines that felt almost symbolic: two paths. One continent, Malema's fall; Traoré's rise. For many Americans over 60 who follow African affairs, this contrast struck a deep emotional chord. It reminded them of the 1960s when moral courage, not charisma, defined leadership. The question they began asking wasn't just about South Africa, but about the world itself. If Africa can rediscover its moral center, can the West do the same? Because the truth is, the crisis of integrity is not African. It's human. And perhaps that's why the story of Julius Malema feels so universal, a leader rising on fire and justice, only to be consumed by the same fire he once lit. In that contrast, the name Ibrahim Traoré began to symbolize something more than politics. To many around the world, it represented the one thing modern leadership keeps losing: the courage to remain clean when surrounded by dirt. There's a moment somewhere between outrage and exhaustion when people stop asking who is guilty and start wondering what went wrong with us all. That's where South Africa now stands. The fall of Julius Malema is not just a headline, it's a mirror, a reflection of how revolutions, when built on charisma instead of character, always collapse under their own weight. He was brilliant, fearless, and for a time the voice of the voiceless. But when truth finally caught up with him, it wasn't foreign enemies that brought him down, it was the silence of his own conscience. And that silence has a cost. A nation cannot heal when its loudest voices have nothing pure left to say. A continent cannot rise when every new promise feels like an echo of the last betrayal. The narrator's words from the video still linger like a sermon: "You cannot serve God and Karl Marx. You will love one and despise the other." Whether or not you share his faith, the message is unmistakable. No ideology can replace integrity. You can change systems, constitutions, and slogans, but if the heart of leadership remains corrupt, the nation remains enslaved. Yet, there is still light. Across the Sahel, in a place once forgotten by the world, a different kind of leader has emerged, one who rebuilds through example, not excuses. President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso doesn't just speak of sovereignty, he lives it. He cleans streets with soldiers, sleeps among miners, and reminds his people that independence begins with discipline. To many Africans and to thoughtful Americans watching from afar, Traoré's journey feels like a quiet answer to Malema's downfall. One man shouted revolution, the other embodied it. One built a following, the other built a nation. And maybe that's the warning for all of us. Democracy, socialism, capitalism. It doesn't matter what flag it flies under. Without integrity, every system becomes a weapon against the people it was meant to serve. So tonight, as we close this story, the real question isn't whether Julius Malema is guilty. The question is far more personal. Do we still have the courage to demand honesty from those who lead us and from ourselves? If you believe that truth still matters more than politics, share this message. If you believe that Africa's new generation leaders like Ibrahim Traoré deserve to be heard, not silenced, then subscribe and stand with us. Because this isn't just about one man's fall. It's about the rebirth of an entire continent that refuses to lose its soul.